Well, on another topic, concern is growing what a war of words between the U.S. and China, whether it could escalate to a full-blown trade war. Beijing has threatened to retaliate if the president follows through on his threats to impose tariffs on an additional $100 billion worth of Chinese goods. The back and forth between the world's two largest economies sent shudders through the markets, especially after a warning from Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin. By the end of the trading day on Friday, the Dow plunged 572 points. That's just over 2% of its value. Politico reporter Louis Nelson is in Washington and joins me now. So we were talking, the president said that there was really, there could be some short-term pain in the market as his administration looks to get some sort of a favorable deal with China. But Louis, what do you think? What happens if this game of chicken doesn't really work out for him?
Well, there's certainly the risk that politically, this could be a difficult thing for Republicans to deal with coming up in 2018. I think there's real fear, especially among Republicans on Capitol Hill, that after this big success of passing the tax cut bill that the president had championed and that a lot of lawmakers, prominent lawmakers on Capitol Hill had championed, they were all really excited to run on that in 2018. It's a big victory, and it has proven, at least if you, according to Republican talking points, put money back in the pockets of American people. And I think there's concern that a trade war, if it really comes to that, if there's these sort of tit-for-tat tariffs imposed between China and the U.S., that the resulting increase in the price of consumer goods that come, especially the ones imported from China, that's going to wipe out a lot of the economic benefit from the tax cut. If you have more money in your pocket, but that money, ends up all getting spent on more expensive things at Walmart and the grocery store and things like that, it ends up being a net neutral, and you can't really run on that quite as well in a midterm election as you might have been able to on just tax cuts alone. Yeah, and Louis, speaking of trying to run on something, do you think the president is also attempting to fulfill another campaign promise? I want to touch about immigration in particular. Late on Friday, the president signed this memo pushing for the end of what some called catch and release. That's when illegal immigrants are let go out of their detention as they wait their hearing. Texas and Arizona have already deployed hundreds of National Guard personnel to that border. Do you think this aggressive posture will push Congress to act on some sort of immigration? I think that's an interesting question, and I think it remains to be seen. I think it's fairly unlikely legislatively that a whole lot more is going to get done before the 2018 elections. Over the summer, lawmakers are going to be running for, especially in the House, which seems to be shaping up to be the sort of more contentious 2018 midterm election. That's where the Democrats really seem to be able to threaten to sort of take over a majority on Capitol Hill. It seems unlikely that there's going to be a lot of legislative movement just because of the upcoming elections alone. And beyond that, the president and the White House can sort of hem and haw about pushing for, we want immigration legislation. We need to strengthen our borders. We need to toughen all these things up. Under the Obama administration, there was a real bipartisan push, at least in the Senate. There was that Gang of Eight bill, famously Marco Rubio, a prominent Republican who wound up running for president, was a big part of that legislation to try to get some comprehensive immigration reform done. And then it just completely died in the Senate. And that was when there was at least some bipartisan support for something like that. It doesn't seem to me that Democrats are terribly eager to do any sort of bipartisan immigration reform, at least do it on the president's terms. I think they would do it. I don't think they're going to do it if it involves funding the president's wall. And I don't think the president is going to be on board unless it funds the wall. Louis, meanwhile, the Associated Press is reporting EPA Chief Scott Pruitt spent millions of taxpayers' money on his security detail. We're talking it's like 3 times the size of his predecessors. Why do you think it is the president still continues to stand by him? Well, that's a good question, and I think there's certainly a lot of talk here in Washington about how much longer the president is going to be willing to stand by him. I think for now, at least my sense, and I think the sense of some others, has been that while Scott Pruitt certainly has been the source of a lot of personal scandals and things like that, things like you mentioned the security detail, but also his sort of high-end flying habits. He likes to fly, or at least for a while was insisting on flying first class on taxpayer dollar. And then just yesterday, AP reported when he was flying for personal reasons, like if he's flying back home to Oklahoma to go to Oklahoma Sooner football games, he'd fly coach on his own money, but on the taxpayer dime was flying first class, things like that. There's a lot of sort of personal scandal and things like that. But he has been very effective as an EPA administrator in terms of pursuing the Trump administration's agenda of deregulation and things like that, sort of undoing a lot of the Obama-era EPA policies and things like that. Scott Pruitt's been really, really effective at doing that kind of stuff. And I think there's a differentiation there if you compare him to somebody like former Health and Human Services Secretary Tom Price, who my colleagues at Politico reported really heavily on his insistence and preference for flying private airplanes and things like that at tremendous expense to taxpayers. The difference between Price and Pruitt was that Price's sort of big push to repeal and replace Obamacare wound up falling flat, didn't work. And so in addition to being sort of a big scandal headache for the president, policy-wise, he wasn't getting a lot done, whereas Pruitt thus far is.
So he still feels like he's helpful in the policy front, and maybe part of the reason why he's still there. So CBS News has confirmed that the negotiations for a Mueller-Trump interview are progressing and that they could be concluding in the near future. So there's also talk of how the president might exactly be prepped for something like this. On Friday, we heard Oliver Stone, a Trump ally, warn against talks between both Mueller and the president. He actually called it a perjury trap. What does that mean?
Well, you don't have to be a political expert or some sort of presidential historian to watch President Trump speak and get the sense that he shoots from the hip very often and is generally pretty sure that he is his own best communications advisor. He is his own best strategist. And so I think there is concern among those advising the president that if he goes into a situation with Robert Mueller, known to be sort of a very fastidious, a very thorough investigator, that if the president goes in there and shoots from the hip as he normally does, and is prone to uses the kind of hyperbole that he's really known for, he's going to put himself in a position where he could potentially perjure himself. There's a lot of, there's past precedent for this. When the president has had to give depositions in legal cases in the past, not as a politician, but as as the real estate tycoon that he was before he got into politics, truthfulness has not always been a trait of his. There are a lot of characteristics you could ascribe to the president, but always being truthful is not one of them. If you read in The Art of the Deal in his book, he says as much, that sometimes a little hyperbole can go a long way. That's been his sort of style well before he got into the political arena, and I think there's a lot of concern that it could get him into a lot of trouble with somebody like Robert Mueller.
Bottom line, though, you think he'll ultimately come forward and speak to Mueller?
Boy, that's a great question. I think who knows, but the president has indicated that he really wants to talk to Mueller, says he is looking forward to talking to Mueller. Whether or not his aide, there are a lot of aides who don't want him to, whether they can talk him out of it remains to be seen, although sort of in a general sense, it's been proven sort of time and time again that it is difficult to talk President Trump out of doing something that he wants to do.
That is certainly the case. We've seen that over and over again. Lewis Nelson, thank you so much for joining us.